movie The King of Kings that he was very good, with Warner.
H.B. Warner.
H.B. Warner.
Right.
You know,
Yes, that, by the way, there was also a sequence of guest directing. I mean, Griffith was on that too, yes. I mean, DeMille did this right down the years. Right down the years.
Something that follows very well on what Belden said when he was here about the essential quality of films. The visual quality of films really being lost in time. They have a very short life. When you talk about the sensual, the gorgeousness of America, and you talk about the sparks and everything else, I swear to you, you didn't see them in its version. But also the film entirely was awfully grubby, this print. And I don't know what better prints are around. Or maybe this one you saw in the West Coast. But the only thing that worked for me, in this movie that I really felt excitement that something took place, followed right in line with what Kabelka had said. There was a scene where two men on top of the fortress wall get shot, and there's an interlocking of about 6 shots. I didn't study it. It just happened very, very fast. Maybe the whole thing is in about 30 seconds. But
you mean on the stockade wall of Fort Sacrifice
right.
During the Indian attack?
Yeah.
Yes.
One man is shot, has a mustache, and next to him another man falls in the hands of a third man, and there's a knitting together of about maybe 6 or 7 or 8 shots. Very hard to tell, but they all really grasp each other, the knot, and that was just like popped out of the rest of this meandering sloppiness that we were looking at. That was my impression, and that became not because of the subject matter for me, or the appearance of the objects, just because of its plastic character.
I'll tell you what else.
Despite the messiness of the film image by this time, in a scratched 60mm version, this worked just on dynamics and rhythm and movement. It didn't depend on any kind of inner pictorial beauty. Just on like Eisenstein.
I understand.
On the way things were knit together.
I understand. I'll tell you what else you missed. I wasn't here for the showing of this particular print. It isn't necessary. I have seen it before, and I don't ever want to look at it again because for me it's not a film. It's a trailer. It's like a few advance shots to tease you to come next week for the opening, you see. And I'll tell you what else you missed, I know, from this print. That was the sequence of Valley Forge. That was probably the most publicized single occurrence throughout the production of America, because all winter there had been practically no snow. And it was just Griffith's bad luck that he ran into a mild winter. And he had already announced that he refused to fake any snow, that there would be no salt or other substances such as they used in Hollywood. And he even gave out an interview to the Sun, the New York Sun, that here he was in the Northeast, where snow falls every winter, and that it would be absurd for him to resort to doing what he would have to do if his studios had remained in Hollywood, and that is to fake it. And he waited and waited, and the investors were getting very nervous, and all the affiliated organizations were beginning to mutter, and Griffith stubbornly held his ground, and finally, toward the end of January, there was a big storm, a big snowstorm, and the frantic calls went out for the extras, and the Griffith studios were placed on a 24-hour round-the-clock basis. They did everything short of kidnapping and shanghaiing people from the roads around Westchester County to get them over there, and that was the time that they made a big raid on Mamaroneck High School. Practically all of us were in it. We were just hurtled off in buses because we had a wild time, and we had to put on the costumes, the uniforms. And the Valley Forge set was immense. It was simply immense. He had the whatever the number was of the log cabins that had been used at Valley Forge at the time, it was the exact number that he used, and he even had the cabins way off on the hillsides where the lookouts had been stationed. And the snow kept coming down, and Griffith was out there. I tell you, it was still dark. And because when I went from my house at that time, that was at the crossroads of Larchmont and Mamaroneck, out in Larchmont Woods, and it was about 3.5 miles. And my parents had some difficulty in getting an old Italian taxi driver whom they knew to come out to the house to drive me to the studio. And it was still dark when this happened. I got out there, and Griffith was there. And when the first streaks of semi-light came through, you remember it was still snowing, and this dark gray sky, and he was showing some of the extra help how it should look when one of the wagons was supposed to have partially broken down. They had some covered wagons there bringing supplies up a slope, and the boys had rags around their feet, but they weren't doing it in the right way. It looked too comfortable. It just looked as if their feet were cozy and warm, you see, and holes were cut, and the goods was shredded, and so on. And the old man removed his shoes and socks and pulled up his trousers and got in and showed them how it should be, and scraped his bare feet, on pebble and stone, and pushed and so on, and they rehearsed this thing over and over, and this went on, and he spent days at Valley Forge during the snow and after the snow, after the snow had stopped falling. And this was a big sequence on the screen, and much was made of it, and he cut to it 3 or 4 times in the film. When was it? That was 1924, during the Second World War. Roughly 20 years later, DeMille made a picture for the U.S. government. It was a propaganda film to aid the war effort. It was called The Land of Liberty, and it was a compilation of excerpts from old newsreels, documentaries, and so on, all bearing on American history in different stages. And about 1/2 of the Valley Forge sequence from America was cut into DeMille's edition of The Land of Liberty. And when I saw that, I even saw some shots in The Land of Liberty that had not appeared in the original version of America, because the Griffith outtakes on Valley Forge were equal to a full-length feature production. You could have made a separate film out of this. And DeMille simply bought that footage. And it was accredited, too, on the screen as a sequence from Griffith's America.
A number of us felt, I don't know how many, that Larry had just looked up Birth of the Nation that morning in his class before we showed America. And a number of us felt, looking at this version of America, that we were looking at an unstrung, spineless remake of the Birth of a Nation.
Ken, you know what you were looking at in effect?
You're right.
You were looking at the Rushes.
But you know how much the story...
I will not... Look, I will not again request bookings of Griffith's America until the day that the Museum of Modern Art gets a print of that film. I mean, what you saw was the scrambled assemblage of the British edition, and I suspect probably some of the rushes and outtakes too. I mean, because what the British government required Griffith to do with America caused him to lose all further interest in the film.
Right, but there are tremendous similarities. You want to know what he does here? First of all, in Birth of the Nation, you have the warring white brothers, and they're being disturbed by a third element, in this case the blacks. And but they're Christian brothers, really.
Right.
And the Birth of the Nation is, they come together at the end. They come together and they get rid of the black man in this kind of dream movie, The Birth of the Nation.
That's the theme of the film,
right.
that the white America finally sees the light when it buries its own differences and joins forces against the black race.
And that is not different in America. When the movie somehow gets rid of Butler and the renegades and the rebels, then they patch up the differences. The Christian and English-speaking worlds patch up their differences. Now the English-speaking civilization will be able to progress without the problems of the taxation and the enforced relationship. But he is, at least in that version that we saw, the British version, he's emphasizing the broadening of the English culture, the English Christian culture.
Yes.
And that's essentially the same theme as the Birth of a Nation.
That's true. That's
also,
true, yes.
He uses the same devices in this case, Butler plays the almost exact same role as, what's the name of the character? Stolman.
Wait a minute. You say Butler in America has a role corresponding to what?
Silas Lynch.
To Silas Lynch, yes.
It's almost the same character.
That's right.
Also the family, the splitting, the coming together, understanding that they really have no differences. They really are related, and it's Butler or Lynch that are that's in the way. The rebels that are in the way, they really can get together. So there really is no need for a real revolution, just a separation, but the same thing, the same kind of economy, the same kind of morality can be extended throughout the world.
I can accept all of this if you will allow me to add that, as far as I'm concerned, there was actually no real revolution in colonial America either. The British yoke was thrown off. Taxation, that is, taxation to the crown, was abolished. The independence was established. But let us never forget, let us always remind ourselves that it was called for generations, not the American Revolution, but the War for Independence. It was simply a war of independence from England. And there was no deep break. We were discussing this, Shelley and I were discussing this before in the snack bar, contrasting the American Revolution with the French Revolution. The French Revolution was an honest-to-God revolution. That went deep, very deep. Boy, that blasted some 1,700 years of established history in the Western world. It was a revolution not only against the French aristocracy, but against the church and against the whole structure that we would now term the establishment, a structure that had come down from the days of the fall of the Roman Empire. I mean, this was a revolution in the deepest sense. In some respects, the French Revolution went even deeper than the Russian Revolution. Incidentally, it included the first sexual revolution, at least during the period of the Carmagnole and the Reign of Terror. And incidentally, something of this, at least, is brought out in Griffith's film on the French Revolution, Orphans of the Storm. There was nothing comparable in the American Revolution at all. As I pointed out before to Shelley, in the American Revolution, the field hand who lived in what amounted to chattel slavery before the war against England began, the so-called American Revolution, continued in chattel slavery after the surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown. There was no change in his status whatever. Changes were made on paper. They were not applied, and no machinery was set up to enforce any of the few liberalizing effects that were decreed.
I also know the soldiers, the people who became soldiers were supposed to be paid. And,
well, forget that.
The first thing the new American Congress did was break it up and direct whatever money there was to just the big money powers that were.
That's right.
There.
That's right.
Started out the way it is today.
Oh well, of course.
When did this phrase, the American Revolution, begin to be popularized? Do you know?
Well, actually, Paine used it at the time, and probably because it came from Paine, the new leaders, the rulers of the new establishment, thereupon shunned the word. It was a word from that disheveled bum down the road. I mean, I told Shelley before, Paine refused to wear a wig. He refused to dress up in the Hollywood costume of the period, all this braid and brocade. That's an incidental thing. Listen, I deny that Paine was anti-Jewish. I absolutely deny this. I deny this absolutely because the fact is that there were a few Jews in the American colonies. Most of them sided with England. Ergo, Paine was against them. But there were also some, remember, that supported the revolution. Remember, there was Chaim Solomon. And, I absolutely deny that Paine was anti-Jewish. I mean, Paine was a free-thinking radical who today would be accepted on all hands, and especially by the establishment, as a left-winger.
I think it becomes intentional because it goes on quite a bit, but he would be a left-winger today.
Oh, definitely.
He was anti-capitalist. That's important, I think.
Well, he was anti-capitalist, but your heart certainly isn't going to bleed over that. I mean, this is... I don't know. I don't know how Paine felt about slavery. I don't offhand recall. I don't know that the issue arose. Well, he was certainly against slavery per se. I mean, we have writings on that, but whether he pinpointed it to slavery of the blacks, this I do not offhand know. I do know that when Washington freed his slaves, it was a gesture, and it had no more value than a gesture. I also know that when other members of the other leaders of the American Revolution, that means members of the wealthy class of the period, that when they freed their slaves, they made gestures too, because remember that there was no formal or official abolition of the institution of black slavery. He said that was the only slavery then known officially. There was widespread enslavement of poor whites, but it wasn't called by that name, you see. But I do know that when they freed their slaves, they encountered the first experience of blacks who refused to be freed. They too did not want freedom. They were quite comfortable and secure. All the damage, the main damage against the blacks, had come in the earlier period when they were kidnapped and forcibly brought over in chains, shanghaied and brought over in chains from Africa. And then the next great wave of damage came later, in the beginning of the 19th century, rather than during the period of the Revolution, because the colonies were rocked by this war. And the whole issue of black slavery tended to be sidetracked and obscured by the Revolutionary War. It was there. It wasn't buried. It wasn't eliminated. But it simply was not the burning issue of the moment. The burning issue of the moment was freedom from England.
Just if I could go on from there first.
Please go on.
A note on slavery. Wasn't slavery abolished under law in Great Britain in 1832, roughly?
I think so.
32, the Act of Parliament.
I think so.
But the way slavery started in the English-speaking colonies in North America was a slow legal process of stealing fragmentarily, bit by bit, human rights from the Negroes. Because at first, Negroes came to the United States under, a phony legalistic structure.
So they came in chains,
really shanghaied and kidnapped,
right.
As you say, sold to merchants. The legalistic basis on which they came was the same as white slaves. In other words, there was slavery at this time under British law. You could sell yourself as an indentured servant,
right,
for a specific amount of time, and that could be life, if necessary. And if you were under a capital punishment of some kind or life imprisonment, you could sell yourself to be shipped to the colonies, or you could sell yourself for a certain number of years to pay passage, keep, and so on, and then you were freed. So they had people getting off the hook, buying their freedom back, selling their labor under a contract for a certain number of years. So it's kind of, it's contractual slavery for specified amounts of time. So they brought the Negroes over, and, they got their thumbprint or whatever spurious legal machinery there was. And at first they brought them as technically indentured. Then, very gradually, and this is all documented, the legal documents of the colonies, they finally got to the position where they said they had no human, not human rights but they had no civil rights because they were not Christians.
Right.
And so by the time they did this, they took away the rights that a normal Christian European would have permanently. Then the next step was to say that their children were born in this state. After they did this, it didn't matter that these people were converted to Christianity.
Oh,
They'd
no.
permanently been deprived of their,
They converted to
of their rights.
Christianity, and lo and behold, discovered that they still were slaves.
Yeah, but they actually began on the same basis as the European indentured servants. Then the British government, it's interesting, Queen Elizabeth actually had to make some decisions that far back, and some of her privateers, the people who were government pirates, got the license to prey on cargoes and so on, wrote to her, and this is documented too, and asked her permission to join in the slave trade that other nations were in, like the Spanish and Portuguese and so on. And under British law, reacting on advice under British common law thinking, she said, no, this is barbaric and illegal, and it's a crime in the eyes of man and God, and so on. And they wrote back to her, and they have these documents. Well, the Crown would get this percentage, we would get this percentage.
Right.
And she approved.
Right.
So that there was a breaking point where it was permitted under all kinds of arrangements, but under English common law, slavery was impossible. And then, despite that, they had later to repeal it explicitly at the beginning of the 19th century. And the American colonies never went that far. They had an embargo. An embargo was put on in the Constitution. Remember, if you read the Constitution, it's written in, at a certain point, they shall no longer import slaves. And then at that point, they must cut off. And then they're going to count, every 5 slaves will count as one human being for purposes of census for determining congressional districts.
Imagine.
Yeah, so a slave
5
equals
heads
1/5 of a white freeman.
In the new arithmetic equal 1 head.
Yeah, that's actually a constitutional arrangement, so that many things were accomplished by the Civil War, such as even technically counting a black man as a whole, numerical unit rather than 20%.
I think at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War, a black counted for 1/2.
Well, they might have made
Yes,
political arrangements.
He was raised to 1/2. He was 1/2 a person, 1/2 a being.
There was famous court case where what you were speaking about was brought up, that he had that this black man was freed by his master, but they taken to court that was impossible because the man didn't have any civil liberties. I forgot the name of the case though.
That wasn't the Dred Scott decision, was it?
No, that's something else.
Wasn't the Dred Scott case?
That might be confusing or something else.
It probably was one of the cases involving the Underground Railway.
That's a different legal problem. That's when there has been no manumission, as it's called, where freedom has been given by the owner, and the person escapes to a free territory. Congress made a law stating that the person had to be remitted. If he were caught, he had to be remitted to the place from which he escaped. If he weren't caught, then he just simply had escaped by default of the authorities to take care of him. But that's something else, So in effect, what it meant was that all Negroes who were lucky enough at that time, to be born north of the Mason-Dixon line, could remain free, as they had been under all law, British law, then American law, colonial law, all law. See, they had white slaves and black slaves in the north until the time they decided that they went one legal course. They evolved in the pathway that all these people were equal legally, and they could then get themselves off the hook by working their way out. Whereas in the South, they went over wholly to, because they had the blacks as the cheap labor, they no longer needed to bother to have indentured servants down south. So they They had the white slaves indirectly because they had the competitive labor. So they went on this other pathway, and they had to set the whites up in enmity, the poor whites against the blacks. And that's why they evolved with that separate system.
The points that Dr. Gillespie has just raised are very interesting for us from another standpoint, another angle, and that is that, remember that England never had, and as far as I know to this day, does not have a constitution as does the United States. And still, at a much earlier period, far earlier than in this country, there were already more and better civil liberties in England than there were here. And this after the American Revolution, no less. Imagine. And it's interesting to note that this fact, separate and apart from economic factors, was not merely known, but very emotionally appreciated by the Canadians, who had a golden opportunity during the War of 1812 to merge with the United States. Canada could have become a part of the United States, instead of which, when they compared their own lot to the lot of the newly emancipated colonies, they beat the daylights out of the Yankees in the battle near Toronto and pushed the Yankees right back across the border. They wanted no part of it because the economic and social conditions in the new nation, the United States, at the time of the War of 1812, was simply frightful, just frightful. If you had been around at the time, in other words, to take this fanciful example, if you had known then what you know today, and you were wandering around during the America of 1812 simply as a spectator, you would have wondered, you would have been bewildered and puzzled by all the talk of the recent revolution. What revolution? Where? It was a 7-year war with the British troops over taxes. Beyond this, there apparently was no revolution at all. And furthermore, the condition of the blacks alone, leave the whites out of it for the moment, the condition of the blacks alone grew worse in the South after liberty had been proclaimed throughout the land from 1776 to 1783. It grew steadily worse. Before the middle of the 19th century, the black was a part of the manacle around his ankle.
Yeah, I would agree that the black fortunes hit their nadir about 1920 in this country.
Well, I was going to say that if you talk to any...
bounced off the bottom.
Well, then it got even worse after the American Civil War. Then it really hit rock bottom.
Yeah, right.
By 1920, lynching was the popular American outdoor sport.